Good evening. It's great to see everyone. My name is Karen Warren Coleman. I'm the Vice President for Campus Life and Student Services. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you here this evening for this event. We're excited about this discussion and look forward to our dialogue and engagement on these issues this evening and in many months and years to come. I think it's worthwhile for me to take a moment and share with you the university's civility statement in advance of our dialogue tonight. At the University of Chicago, freedom of expression is a fundamental value. To allow all members of our community to learn and share ideas, we must protect civil discourse. That includes listening to speakers and participating in the question and answer that'll follow. Disrupting speakers may result in removal from the event. I don't anticipate that. And we appreciate your help in supporting these shared values. One of our greatest strengths at the University of Chicago is the diversity of experiences and perspectives of our students and our scholars. As members of the university community, we expect to be engaged, to be invited to participate in an educational experience that involves the exchange of ideas with some of the most incredible minds in the world. We expect to create new knowledge and new ways of meaning, to be ambitious, and to be guided by values of respect, inclusion, and the freedom to speak and to be heard. These ideals extend well beyond the classroom. And all that we do is guided by principles of academic discovery that welcomes diversity in all of its forms. We value people for their contributions and reject inequities based on identity. Our community thrives when we recognize that our differences are a starting point for greater understanding. As I shared in a recent statement to students, tonight's program is one example of this commitment and an embodiment of our commitment to the RISE campaign, which we just recently announced. Reflect, intervene, speak, and engage. RISE. The RISE campaign will encourage the university community to educate and to challenge assumptions about the role of class, race, gender identity, sexual orientation, religion, nationality, disability, and other aspects of identity. As part of this campaign, tonight we welcome Soledad O'Brien. Now, I would like to introduce Jasmine Taylor, a member of my newly formed Vice President's Advisory Council on Diversity and Inclusion. Jasmine is a Doctor of Medicine candidate at Pritzker School of Medicine and slated to graduate in June 2014. A native of Decatur, Georgia, Jasmine received her bachelor's degree in anthropology from Washington University in St. Louis. She has received numerous awards for her commitment to service in the community and globally, including the University of Chicago's President's Volunteer Service Award, the Charles M. Ross Trust Fellowship, and the Valerie Jarrett Bowman Scholarship. While at Washington University, she also spent a semester studying community health in South Africa. During her time at the University of Chicago, Jasmine has served as student liaison for the Associate Dean of Multicultural Student Affairs Search Committee, the academic co-chair of the Student National Medical Association, and teaching assistant for the Youth Scientist Training Program, which has the goal of increasing the presence of underrepresented minorities in the sciences. Jasmine was also co-coordinator for the Maria Shelter Clinic, a student-run clinic for homeless women and children in Chicago. She has published and presented around the country on topics ranging from teen mothers and social services to federal health care for the homeless. Thank you again for being here, and I present Jasmine Taylor.
Good evening. I am so pleased and excited to have the honor of introducing Soledad O'Brien. Soledad O'Brien, as many of you know, is an award-winning journalist, a CNN special correspondent, and our Kovler Visiting Fellow. She is the CNN special correspondent who recently entered into a unique production and distribution agreement with the network to produce long-form programming specials through her company, Starfish Media Group. Launching in June 2013, the 360 media production company and distributor will be dedicated to uncovering and producing empowering stories that take a challenging look at often divisive issues of race, class, wealth, opportunity, poverty, and personal stories. A critically acclaimed journalist, O'Brien has reported on breaking news from around the globe. In 2011, she won an Emmy for Crisis in Haiti in the category of Outstanding Live Coverage of a Current News Story Long Form. O'Brien was part of the coverage teams that earned CNN a George Foster Peabody Award for its BP oil spill and Katrina coverage, and an Alfred I. DuPont Award for its coverage of the Southeast Asia tsunami. The National Association of Black Journalists named O'Brien the Journalist of the Year, and Edward R. Murrow Awards lauded her with the RT-DNA Unity Award for Latino in America in 2010. O'Brien has been integral in hosting and developing the award-winning Black in America franchise, one of the CNN's most successful international franchises. In 2010, she wrote a critically acclaimed memoir, The Next Big Story, My Journey Through the Land of Possibilities, which chronicles her biggest reporting moments and how her upbringing and background have influenced these experiences. In addition to Starfish Media Group, Soledad and her husband Brad run the Soledad O'Brien and Brad Raymond Foundation, which sends young women to and through college. A graduate of Harvard University, she lives with her husband and 4 children in Manhattan. Let's welcome Soledad O'Brien.
Good evening, everybody. It was an honor and a real pleasure to chat with many of the students this afternoon, even though some of them were simultaneously tweeting what I was saying, which is a little bit unnerving, but I get it. I'm cool with that. I want to talk tonight about leadership because I think often when we have conversations about diversity, it's really a conversation about leadership. I'm going to throw out some names for you. Franklin McCain, Joseph McNeil, Ezell Blair, David Richmond. Any of those names ring a bell? They're civil rights pioneers, believe it or not, and from their dorm room in Greensboro, North Carolina, they actually plotted to do the first sit-in at a Woolworth's counter in Greensboro. I visited the Greensboro Civil Rights Museum not very long ago and stood exactly where these 4 young men sat and made history. Their sit-in actually would kick off sit-ins around the nation, and yet we don't really know their names. In fact, I don't even know them. I always have to look them up every time I talk about them. And that's because the fight for civil rights is never ending. Sometimes I think we get the sense that it ends with the March on Washington, or it ends with some kind of legislation signed by Congress, but it doesn't. It just doesn't end. And there are many people, some of them, whose names will never be remembered, who are part of that fight. I'm not a civil rights pioneer. I'm a reporter, though, who is very honored to tell the stories of those folks. Stories of civil rights legends, regular people trying to make a paycheck, stories of Muslims trying to build a mosque, or coal miners trying to stay in their jobs. These are the stories that I've had the real pleasure to tell as a reporter over the last 26 years. I started working in TV news in 1987. My very first job was to remove staples from the 3 floors of WBZ-TV in Boston. My parents, who had just spent $100,000 on my education at Harvard, to say that they were disappointed does not come close. My mother's like, really, that's a job? But it was, and I loved it. One way we would be able to make more money was by inserting ourselves into stories. Because I was not a reporter, I was a very low level, lowest level production assistant, they'd have to pay you if somehow you ended up in the story, or if your voice was in the story. For example, if I did an interview with, say, the mayor, they called that getting sound, I'd run out and grab a couple of quick questions with the mayor, I would only ask leading questions so that there was no way to edit around his answer. I'd say, Mr. Mayor, you're disappointed in this legislation because, and there was no way to just take the essence of his answer and have it make sense. So they'd have to put my question in, and they'd have to pay me $35. And, yeah, brilliant, right? Or, when you do that interview, hold the mic up here. And those fingertips under the mayor's chin, those would be mine. That was $25 extra if a body part of yours ever made it into the newscast. And we could do the brilliant, right? We could do this enough times to actually make enough money that we could both eat and pay our rent. But I absolutely loved it. I loved having a part in telling stories. I loved the opportunity to change journalism and to impact the kinds of stories that we were telling. I got to cover the Asian tsunami in 2005 and Hurricane Katrina and the Haitian earthquake and the Japanese earthquake and tsunami. Did documentaries like Black in America and Latino in America, and documentaries on Dr. King and the Atlanta child murders, the mysteries of Jonestown. Looked at sexism and opportunities for women in our documentary about rescue workers, the women of Ground Zero, and told stories about race and racism and discrimination and opportunity in our Black in America and Latino in America documentary series. And I absolutely loved it. But over the years, I really began to figure out the philosophy of what I wanted to do. And I have a theory, so follow with me on this. When Britney Spears hops out of a town car and has no underwear on, right? White people everywhere do not say, "Oh my God, I'm so embarrassed for us." They say, "Poor Britney, I hope she feels better. I hope she gets better. She's clearly troubled." But part of the problem in covering race and gender is that often those stories are told so rarely that it actually does matter. For example, I would say there are 100 stories of white people and 5 stories in the local news for Black people, for example, usually about violence or entertainment. For Latinos, there's 3, and most of them are about immigration. There's 1 story for Asians, usually. They're such great students. And there are no stories at all if you're Native American or you're any other outside of those categories. And I remember when I was a kid growing up, my mother used to pray. We had a serial killer on the loose. You might remember this, Son of Sam. And my mother used to pray at night, "Lord Jesus, I hope he's not Black." Because she knew, she fully understood in our community that if, in fact, the serial killer was Black, it would matter to us. We would feel that in our community. And part of that is because there are 100 stories for everybody. But often when you talk about racial and ethnic categories, there are so few that the number of stories really matters. And I like to say I don't do PR. My job instead is to tell 100 stories of everybody, right? Because we're human beings. We are the range of great and terrible. We are the range of sad stories and heroic stories. We're all of those things. And the only way to be fair about it is to tell all those stories for all of us, not just the 5 or the 3 or the 1, but to tell them well. And so I believe that, in fact, this is leadership. And this is why I think diversity is about leadership. When I became a reporter, I had no idea that I'd be chronicling the stories of leaders in the lives of most people you've never heard of. I love telling stories, and when I started out, I would tell stories about overnight fires, so many of those, stories of cats that were stuck in trees and cars that were stuck in snow and politicians that were stuck in messes. But over time, and as my opportunities grew, I started telling stories about the famous and not so famous, those with celebrity, those with notoriety. And I learned most, I think, from regular people who are just trying to get by. People who are grappling with unemployment, like Battle for Blair Mountain, which focused on coal miners in West Virginia. Documentaries like Latino in America that focused on the stories of families with immigrant roots, or Black in America that took an unflinching look at race and racism. And I really enjoyed digging into the conversation, sometimes very uncomfortable conversation, because I think that's really where true leadership can happen. If you can start the conversation and make everybody speak openly about it, that was doable. If you could highlight different voices, the ones that were often ignored, frankly, or as the coal miners in West Virginia told me, same thing as the women of Ground Zero told me, and the same thing that people who were in Black in America told me, nobody ever wants to tell our stories, and that's true. So to me, conversations about what our nation was and is, the only way to do that was by giving everyone a voice. And it was not only a good thing to do, which I think we sometimes say about diversity, it's a good thing to do. It's actually a critical thing to do. You cannot tell the story of America and leave out certain voices. My parents used to tell me the story of how they met. My mom is Black and from Cuba. My dad's white and Australian, and they met because they both attended daily mass. My mother would walk, but my dad had a car. And so he would drive, and as he drove to mass, he'd stop and he'd hit on my mom. He would wind down the window of his car. And this is pre-power windows days, right? So he had to lean in, wind down the window, and basically hit on this woman who's walking to church. My father would say, "Would you like a ride?" And she would say, "No, thank you," because you don't take a ride from a man you don't know very well, even apparently to daily mass. Every single day, "No, thank you. No, thank you." And then one day she said yes, and they made a date to go on a date. But they lived in Baltimore, Maryland. They were both at Johns Hopkins University, and it was 1958. And every single place they went to that evening to go on their date to dinner turned them away, because interracial dating was frowned upon, as my mother said. I said, well, what do you mean by frowned upon? She said, you could get shot. So they went to restaurant after restaurant, and no one would serve them. They'd say to my father, well, you can come in, but to my mother, you absolutely cannot come in, and you certainly cannot come in together. And eventually my mother took my father back to her apartment, and she's a tremendous cook of amazing Cuban food, and she just made him dinner. And her entire point of the story that she would tell to me and my three sisters and my two brothers was, see, girls, if you could cook, you could get a man. That was her entire point. I like to say I can't make it, but I can make it happen. Delivered to my apartment in 20 minutes. When my parents decided to get married at the end of 1958, interracial marriage was illegal in the state that they lived in Maryland. And in 16 other states, there were laws against interracial marriage. And so my mom and dad drove to Washington, D.C., and they got hitched. And then they had friends who would tell them, whatever you do, don't have children, because biracial children will not fit in this world. I'm number 5 of 6. My parents were terrible listeners every step of the way. And I used to ask my mother what it was like to walk around the streets of Baltimore, because they moved back to Baltimore, with people who would say comments to them. And sometimes they would spit on my parents for being together. And my mother used to tell me, Lovey, she calls me Lovey, oh, Lovey. She said, we knew America was better than that. And I love that line, because in some of the conversations that I've heard from the students today, I feel they need to be reminded, right? Whatever frustrating thing is happening, no matter how mad you are and frustrated that you think you're not moving the needle, what really matters is that America is better than that. And it's a goal to get to. And even when people are spitting on you, or it doesn't feel like it's necessarily going your direction, the idea is to stay in the game. And it's up to you to fix it. And I think there's a certain bravery in deciding you're going to sit firmly on the right side of history. My parents were my very first example of forging on anyway, and if you decided to move through life with dignity, that in fact eventually people would follow your lead. My parents would be my first in many ways, the first black family to move into a white suburb. That was fun. I don't speak Spanish well because my mother wanted us to blend in, and she thought that if we spoke Spanish in this community, that we'd stick out more than we already did. So I was looking at a picture of my family in the 1970s. My dad, white, bald. My mother, black, giant afro. 6 kids, all brown kids, 1970. We all have afros, 1970s. So we're wearing shirts that have stripes this way and pants that have stripes this way, and it's 100% polyester, and we're standing in front of our VW bus. And I'm like, we probably could have gone with the Spanish, I'm feeling, because there was no blending at all in this picture. But if you fast forward 35 years from when that photo was taken, and I represent what America looks like today. Diverse and multicultural and multiracial and multi-ethnic. And my family, that was told very clearly many, many times that we would never fit in, we're part of the fastest growing demographic in this nation. And it's amazing how quickly that's happened. And now I get to tell the stories of those outsiders, people who feel like they're on the margins now. The world's changing. The way we tell stories is changing too. Some students have told me they're trying to figure out how to engage people in a conversation. And that's tough. That's going to be a hard thing to do. The only way, though, I think, to be successful in a discussion and a dialogue about diversity, especially an honest one, that can be very messy and very complicated, is to recognize that history changes. And you can be part of making that change happen. But if you stop at every mean word, and if you're derailed by being spit on, literally and metaphorically, you're probably not going to change the world. By the way, the Supreme Court would overturn the ban on interracial marriage in 1967, which was the very same year that my parents had their 6th and final child. My mother liked to say, if you wait for everybody to come around to what you're doing, you could be waiting a little while. History has a way of writing itself. My parents' story had a really inspirational effect on us. It inspired us to know that no amount of discrimination, no number of obstacles placed in our way could keep us from what we wanted to attain. My sister, who was 3 years ahead of me at Harvard, used to tell me about her advisor. She was studying physics, and she said that her advisor made it very clear that she should drop her major, which was physics. And I'd say, oh, you mean he's insinuating that maybe you shouldn't be a physics major? She says, no, he calls me in my dorm room and tells me I should drop my major because girls don't do well in math and minorities don't do well in the sciences. I probably will not succeed as a physics major. And I used to tell her, so how did you do it? She said, well, mom and dad. You know, they made it very clear there was no correlation in someone telling you that something is not possible, except if you think it's possible. My sister, I should mention, got her degree in physics in Harvard at 3 years, went on to get her master's in astrophysics, got her MD and then her PhD in medicine. She's an eye surgeon today, so apparently girls are okay in math and minorities somehow muddle through the sciences and figure it out and get through. For me, I remember doing an interview for a job in Connecticut, and the news director there said to me, Soledad. That's such an interesting name in that way that means so not interesting to them at all. He said, listen, would you be willing to change your name because we're concerned the audience will not be able to understand you? Because obviously I struggle with the language. And he said, now my full name is Maria de la Soledad Teresa Marchetti O'Brien. Turn to your Latino friends and they'll translate for you. That's the Blessed Virgin Mary, roughly. So I knew that if I changed my name, I'd be struck dead by lightning on the way home. And so I wasn't going to change my name. And I called my mother, crying. And I said, you know, I can't fit in this box that everybody has, right? I had this strange name. How could people possibly be able to relate to me and understand me? She said, Lovey, get another job. Go someplace else where people understand you. And I did. And I think that is a typical story for minorities and even people who serve minority communities. There's a lot of no. But even when the statistics and the demographics are on your side, there's a lot of no. And yet we plow on anyway. I knew I'd be a journalist when I was 19 years old. I grew up in a town in the North Shore of Long Island. And my mom was a teacher in my high school. My high school was about 99.9996% white. When I was 19, I was back from college, and I arranged with my mother I could have her Chevette for the day if I picked her up from school. So at 3 o'clock, I went by school to grab her. And as we're leaving the classroom, my mother's walking out. I'm with her. And the principal and the vice principal and the dean have a kid who's probably a 13-year-old black kid in the hallway. And my mother stops. And I die 1,000 deaths. I'm like, come on, let's go. She says, no. And the principal says, Mrs. O'Brien, you can carry on. We've got this under control. Now, there are no black kids in my school. And there's a 13-year-old kid in the hallway with the principal. And my mother says, no, thank you. I think I'll wait for a minute. And she just stands there. My mother's about 5'2", little afro, had one of those little macrame bags for the older people in the audience. Macrame bag in the shape of an owl with beads for the eyes. 1980s were a very bad decade for that. And I remember my mom just stopped and just stood there. And things got very uncomfortable. And the principal said to her once again, Mrs. O'Brien, we've got it under control. You can carry on. And she said, I think I'm just going to wait. Meanwhile, the kid had no idea what was going on. And the weirdest thing to me was that the entire dynamic in that hallway went whoosh to my mother, 5'2", little afro, and her macrame handbag. Because she was the one who was not willing to be shushed away. And some of that dynamic was about race, but really it was more about being willing to stand with somebody and for somebody. And it made me realize that the person who actually had all the power was the one who would not be shooed away. And that if you did it right, a reporter could do that. Things got very uncomfortable. The principal said to the boy, young man, do not run in the halls. The kid went off. And we left. But it made me realize that right there, that was power. And guess what? She didn't do anything. She really didn't say anything. She just refused to go. And I don't think it's an accident that all these many years later, I like to tell the stories of people whose stories are rarely told. I feel like I have an opportunity to stand up for people who might need a voice. And everyone can do that. Everyone in this room who cares about those stories can do that too. For one of my documentaries, I got special permission to hold Dr. King's papers at the Woodruff Library in Atlanta University Center. And I was very nervous because I drop things and I tend to rip things and spill things. And I was holding, without gloves or anything, Dr. King's original sermon. And we were doing a documentary called Words That Changed the Nation. So we were looking very closely at sort of the first version of the speech that he wrote and then the second version and how they compared. And in his own library, what did he think was interesting? What did he circle? What did he highlight? What did he underline? Dr. King, we learned in this particular documentary, was a regular man, one who was young and smart, but mostly he was present when the moment called. He was steady when pretty much everybody else who was sane would run. He was poetic. He clearly valued words. But it was obvious that his writings came from a man who was inspired by a moment. And people would say, I've now done many documentaries on Dr. King, well, Dr. King was like Jesus come to earth. And I would say after this documentary, no. The point was, no, he was not. The point was, he was a regular man who decided that he could do great things as a person, who decided that he could and he would lead. He wrote this: after one has discovered what he is called for, he should set out to do it with all the power that he has in this system. Do it as if God Almighty has ordained you at this particular moment in history to do it. And so he does. And I would argue in that very line, he's kind of speaking to all of us. Whenever I read that, especially in a pulpit, it's just like, wow, he's talking to us. 1954, Dr. King was 25 years old when he wrote his first sermon. Think about that, 25 years old, 4 pages, front and back of notebook paper, talking to folks in Montgomery, Alabama. Within a year of that speech, simple speech, Rosa Parks would take one of the seats reserved for whites at the front of the bus. And Dr. King would be plucked from obscurity to become the voice of the bus boycott movement. And he's chosen because he's non-controversial. He's a young man who everybody kind of likes. But he ends up being the person who articulates the philosophy of a movement that has been quoted since that era in every conflict. He's chosen, though, because he's non-controversial and he's a guy who everybody likes. But he ends up being the leader of one of the most powerful movements in the world because he decides he's going to lead. He decides to use his voice to take a stand. He decides that he's going to take a position that maybe some people don't agree with. Even his own people will revile him and ridicule him. And he decides to stand up anyway. That's leadership. And I guess, for me, ultimately, leadership is about justice. Leadership is about taking a stand for justice for people whose voices aren't heard, or things that need to be said that people don't necessarily want to say. That is literally what Dr. King died for. People will often cite Dr. King's speech on the Washington Mall. They'll call it the I Have a Dream speech, but of course it was never called that. People love to quote, I have a dream, and content of character. Nice phrases you could kind of throw on a t-shirt if you wanted to. But the I Have a Dream speech was actually called Normalcy Never Again. And I'll read you a few other phrases from that very speech. We've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. It's obvious that America has defaulted on its promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Oh, go back to content of character. I like that part better. When you tell people, here's one, the Negro has been delivered a bad check, everybody gets downright shifty in their seats because it makes them uncomfortable. But that was the uncomfortable message that Dr. King was delivering. That was the message. Digging into the fairness and justice can make us all uncomfortable. Not some sanitized version that I think we like to recall today. The I Have a Dream part was ad-libbed. Set it off, flipped his speech over and set it off the top of his head. So for me, true leadership is about departing from the speech as you know it. True leadership is about taking a different path because you understand the critical value of fairness and justice. Those are values this nation was built upon. True leadership is about going off script because, it's more important to be on the right side of history. True leadership is about blunt conversation. And it's not about change coming today or tomorrow or the next day. Real change, history-making change takes time. Much of my reporting, I think, is oddly about leadership. I don't necessarily start out telling those stories, but when you tell stories about people who are marginalized, they become de facto leaders because their lives are not really about empowering themselves, but really they're willing to talk because they're willing to empower others. In our documentary, Muslims in America, we told the story of Muslim families in a small Tennessee town who were trying to build a mosque and the outrage and the hatred that they faced, but also the surprising support they got as well from people who were not like them, who gathered around to tell them that we support you. And we told the story of a church torn over the acceptance of a growing Latino population. We told the story of female firefighters and rescuers who fought for recognition, who felt they'd been written out of history in 9/11. At a screening of that documentary, someone said to me, stood up, "Why are you telling that story about women? Do you think women were more brave than the men in 9/11? Why do you feel the need to highlight what the women did? Why are you so divisive when it comes to telling these stories? You have to pluck out the women." One of the firefighters who was at the screening said, "Do you know how many stories CNN did on the German shepherds of 9/11? A lot. I think we can do an hour on what women did in 9/11. I think we have an obligation. And I think here on this campus, you have an obligation. If you want to truly be leaders, to listen to others, to figure out how to move forward in a world that we share. We all have different opinions of what's right and what's wrong. We cannot, though, shut out people that we disagree with. That is not being a leader. That's the definition of being an obstacle. We have to build on our own life experiences with those of others. You got to find connections, build peace, and build civility, and come together, even with people who might completely disagree with you. And to do that, you're going to have to find a way in for those others so you can have real conversation. Ultimately, I think it's our job, and by our, I mean everybody in this room, our job to bear witness to what's happening around you. Unlike those young men more than 50 years ago, we have to decide that the critical issues that we're dealing with today are not just the Black issues or Latino issues or the local issues, but kind of the nation's issues and the global issues. You have to take a stand for that. And I think it's hard. I think it's daunting. I think it often can be thankless. But I'll tell you, I did a documentary in Haiti. It's one of the saddest things I've ever done. And I was working with these evangelical pastors who'd moved from California. And right after the earthquake, we'd go every day and see babies that were dying in the wake of the earthquake. Everybody had moved outside. And so at one point, I opened up the back of a box truck, and inside are 25 swaddled babies, all dying because they're feeding them mush and milk, like rice and milk mushed together. Babies, of course, can't have that. And so the babies would get sick and dehydrated, and they'd give them more, and they'd get a terrible cycle, and the babies were dying. And I remember saying to this missionary, Suzette, like, how do you do this? This is awful. And how do you commit every day to something that's not going to get done, right? I mean, those guys who started the sit-ins, they didn't know it was going to get done. They couldn't think fast forward 50 years. At the time, it seemed impossible. There are 450,000 orphans in Haiti, and Suzette has 56. It's like, how do you do this? Why do you do this every day? Recommit to something that probably you're not going to make a difference. You're not going to move the needle. Probably not going to do it today, probably not tomorrow, probably not in 10 years, possibly not in 25 years. And she said this to me. Well, Soledad, it's the starfish story. I said, I don't know what you're talking about. So the starfish story. A boy is walking along the beach. Tide's gone out, and all these starfish have been beached. And so the kid starts picking up starfish and chucking them back into the water. And a man says to him, what are you doing? There are 1 million starfish on this beach. This beach goes on for miles. This is a complete waste of time. And the kid picks up a starfish and says, well, I guess it matters to this one, and chucks it in. And when I heard that story, I realized that that story would be the symbol, not just for our documentary, which it was, but for all the work that I was going to do. Right? We can sit here and rail and say, changing the tenor of a campus, changing the way stories are told in the news, changing how we do something is going to be impossible. Or we can start where we are and start picking up starfish and chucking them back in. I choose the latter. I'll leave you with a quote, which is my favorite quote, and I'm very convinced if you're a college student and you work this into a paper, you'll get an A, but I'm making that up. But it goes like this. It's Dante. The hottest places in hell, it's Dante, the hottest places in hell are reserved for those who in times of great moral crisis maintain their neutrality. There's nothing worse than doing nothing and saying nothing when your voice is needed. That actually even being the perpetrator of something bad is less bad than being the person who stands by and could be in a position to use their voice and you opt not to. Maintain their neutrality. Your voice is needed. I invite you to use those voices to make the changes you want to see on this campus and in this world. It's your duty. That's why you're here. Thank you so much. Thank you. I think we have some time for questions. If there are any questions, just raise your hand, and I think you can just go ahead and ask that question. You know, that's a very good question. I'm actually asked that a lot, and I have to tell you, I have never once, I've only worked for big companies. Even when I worked in local news, we were owned by a major company. I have never once had anyone ever call me up or weigh in on how I was doing a story. Usually, no one would see the story outside of an editor, you know, my producer, a small handful of us. If we did a documentary, probably 2 or 3 other people. But there was never, sometimes I get the sense that people feel like there's this corporation that is sitting in, watching very closely on individual stories, guiding. Never happened, especially in a story like Katrina, where you're in the field on the fly. I barely saw the stories. I mean, we were moving so quickly. So the sense that there's a corporation with a capital C that's very closely monitoring what reporters are doing and saying and checking in with us. That has never been my experience in the 26 years I've worked as a journalist, ever. In fact, when I was working at MSNBC, and we want to get Bill Gates, who owned the MS part of the MSNBC, we could never get him to even return our phone calls to come in and be interviewed. They just had no, at that time when I was there, no interest in all editorially in what we were doing. And I have to tell you, if someone did, I would do a story on it. It would be so weird. I mean, it would be such a strange thing if someone called me up and said, listen, this is the front office, and I'm a little concerned about your piece tonight. I would have to talk about it. It would just be so bizarre. So it's never been my experience. I always felt, and I think that anybody who's an individual, even working in a corporation, that you would insert and bring yourself to the job. So I felt my job was in bringing out voices that maybe wouldn't be told, especially covering some disasters. You know, I felt like there are people that we could focus on who might talk to me that might not talk to others. I thought that that was a strength. But I have never, ever gotten guidance from anyone about anything I've done from a, sort of corporate perspective, ever. Thank you for the question.
Good evening, everyone. I just want to interrupt for a moment so we can be assured to hear your questions. We will have a line that we can form right here where we can hear you on the mic, and then over there by my colleague, Charles. I see we have someone ready right now with a question, and we'll go to your question here. And again, we can form another line over here. Thank you.
Thank you. So kind of just to piggyback on this guy's question, now that you have your own media company, will you maybe do a partnership with a larger company similar to maybe like what Vice Media is doing with HBO, or will you just produce individual pieces and how will you distribute them, I suppose?
We'll do production deals. And we're in the middle of figuring this out. Our company doesn't launch until I officially leave CNN in June. But the whole point is, and with technology today, it's actually changed completely, right? Look at the Netflix model. You can just distribute to Netflix if you want to do a documentary that way. And it doesn't necessarily have to go sort of the traditional route. So a lot of people are kind of looking at that model. But yeah, you're exactly right. I think what you want to do for me, number one, find a really interesting story. Number two, figure out how you're going to put it together. Who are going to be your partners in that? Who funds it? Do you self-fund it? How does it work? Sometimes you can, depending on what it is. And then, number three, find a distributor, and where do you want it to air? Google is a distributor. Netflix is a distributor. CNN is a distributor. You figure out who is interested in the stories that you want to tell. For me, part of the thing that I find interesting about this new experiment is I'd like to answer the question, can you just do stories you care about? Can I do no missing cat stories? Can I just do the stories that I think are important and interesting and do that well and be successful in a business context? And I think the answer to that is yes. Our early indications are yes. Thank you for the question. Hey. Oh, I'll take one up here first. Go ahead.
So the question that I had is your own personal story as well as your career has been a wonderful example of how the issues of injustice intersect, and that it is not just an issue about necessarily just race or just sexuality or just economics. What are ways that you think on a grassroots level through either through mass media, like you mentioned so eloquently about looking for distributors for things like that, what are some things that you would like to personally see other people tackle? Either stories that you think aren't being told that should be told, or even possible political movements or social movements that you think need more attention, specifically on the issues of how issues of injustice intersect in society?
I think it's less how the stories that should be told and more how they're told. I think we do a bad job of telling people's real lives. I think if you can do a good job, one of the things that I thought worked well in Black in America and even Latino in America, right? You sort of take somebody and just tell their backstory, right? And we're working on a documentary now about poverty in America. If you look at the working poor, there is this sort of myth that people who are poor are lazy. But when you actually look at the numbers of people who are working poor, they're killing themselves. They're working really, really hard. They just cannot possibly get ahead. And so I think you can do a great service to understand, again, and I don't do PR, right? I'm just going and telling stories about real people and their real lives and what those lives involve. And I think if you just can tell people's stories fully and honestly and with integrity and let them speak for themselves, then you do a justice. Part of the problem, I think, is there's not a lot of space, a newscast for these kinds of stories. I have in the past pitched, poverty in America, and people have said, well, who wants to look at that? Ugh. Like, I do. I think it's especially with the economic downturn and slight recovery, the changing face of that is really interesting. So we will do that because I've been pitching that thing for 5 years, so we're going to do it. So I think it's less about the stories you tell and more about how you tell it. And I'll give you a quick example that I talked to some students about earlier. When we started doing Black in America, I kind of got in a fight with one of my producers because we were telling the story of a school in West Hartford, Connecticut, Steve Perry's school. And there was a young woman, Glorious Menifee, who was sort of the character in the story. Girl about to graduate, go off to college, she was hoping. We were following her progress. And the producer described her as Glorious Menifee. Her mother is a crack addict, her father is an alcoholic. And I would say, right, but we would never describe a middle-class kid that way, right? We'd never say, Billy Bob Smith, his mother's a doctor, his father's a lawyer. We'd say, Billy Bob Smith, kid loves baseball. Whew, he wants to be Derek Jeter when he grows up. He sleeps with his mitt under his bed and blah, 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 And then we'd say, and his mother's a doctor and his father's a lawyer. Because when it comes to middle class and above, we humanize people. We love to tell their stories. When it comes to people in poverty, we tend to dehumanize them and make them sort of the summation of the dysfunction in their life. So it's less about what stories you tell, just more how you tell it. You can let people be themselves and be human beings in just how something is scripted, I think. Thank you for the question. Yeah.
Hi. So this is a slightly political question, and I understand if you don't want to answer it, that's fine.
God, I love the run-up to that. Okay, go ahead, bring it on.
So it's about the Dante quote that you cited. If we are to be the change that we wish to see in the world, and if the hottest ring of hell is reserved for those who stand idly by in times of trouble. What does that mean for America on a national level? Do we intervene to stop gross humanitarian rights violations? What stake do we show that we have in other parts of the world beyond our own borders?
I think that is a question that everyone has to answer, because I think the question is, what does maintain your neutrality mean? Does maintain your neutrality mean you do nothing? Does it mean you raise money? Does it mean you use your voice? I don't know. What I've always liked about that quote is it kind of leaves it open to people, right? What he's saying is the one thing you cannot do is do nothing. Apathy is absolutely unacceptable. But I think students have to decide what is their passion and what do they believe and what do you want to try to do? I don't always agree with, and we earlier talking to some students, things that they support doing, wouldn't be the things that I would support. But I think it's less than, okay, follow that quote and that means intervene in every single circumstance. I think it's more about just the world is for you to figure out how you're going to make it. And if being involved in some capacity is what moves you, then you've got to do that. Thank you. Go ahead.
Good evening, Soledad. I always wanted to ask you this, and I'm not sure if you've been asked this question a lot. I can remember back in 2005 when you reported on Katrina and you were talking to the FEMA director. What exactly was going through your mind at that moment? Because it seemed like you just...
So the FEMA director interview we did in 2005 with Mike Brown. Well, I'd been reading a lot of transcripts. The way we would prepare for the morning show, because I'd go to bed relatively early, is to read everybody's transcript. And I noticed that he kept answering all the questions in the same way. He was very surprised. And everyone, and in fact, there had been an interview with President Bush earlier in maybe the day before, where the president said something like, who knew a hurricane? And I remember thinking well, I knew because CNN gave me the briefing book for Very Large Hurricane Approach. We had a book literally called Very Large Hurricane Approaching New Orleans. And my best friend and executive producer was from New Orleans. And I remember very clearly going through this book being like, damn, if this thing really hits, you are in big trouble. Holy cow, have you read this briefing book? This is terrible. So clearly we all knew if the thing hit head on. Now, as you know, it did not hit head on exactly. Part of the problem was the levees failed, but the damage was severe. And so one of the things that really was troubling to me in interviewing Mike Brown that was sort of surprising was he seemed so surprised. He kept listing all these great things as if I hadn't been on the air the 5 earlier days, covering the story. Well, we got trucks going, and we've got this coming in, and we got food. Right, but I was here for Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And now it's Friday. It just seems so odd. And I think this has been an experience I've had with a number of politicians, is that they sort of feel like if I just tell it this way, you'll believe it. And he was right. All those things were coming, but I'd been on the air for 20 hours by that point, wondering where all this stuff was. I didn't just show up 3 hours ago to do this story. So I just was sort of baffled. You're trying really hard to spin me, and I've been here for the entire thing. You can't spin me. So, I knew a question that would get him was the question that we ended with, which was, are you proud of how FEMA has responded? When you look at your people, are you proud of the work they've done, right? Because that's a very tricky question. And he wasn't really able to answer it. So, I thought that was just a really good interview, because when you cover a story for a long time, you come in with a lot of knowledge. We're equals in the amount of knowledge that we have. You might be running FEMA, but I've been covering the story. So I've probably spoken to more people. And then the other thing was, I felt like my researcher, the person who put together our really bad things that will happen in a big hurricane book, was a 20-year-old. Her name is Jean. It wasn't put together by the team of executives at Rand. It was put together by some young woman who was a production assistant for us. So the idea that it wasn't accessible to everybody was just absurd. And I guess that's what I was trying to make clear to him. Thank you for the question. Hi.
Hey. In the aftermath of the, excuse me, I'm kind of sick, but in the aftermath of the Boston bombings, a fellow CNN reporter kind of made a claim that the suspect was a dark-skinned man, and as a journalist and as kind of a champion of the minority, how do you feel? How did you react to that? And what is more important to you, being the first with the story or being accurate?
Well, I think clearly if being accurate is everything, right? Being first with wrong is useless. I guess my issue with the dark skin comment, and I wasn't on the air for that, and I saw it, and I remember thinking, like, I'm not sure what this means. Like, what is, when you say the suspects are dark skin, are we really trying to say they're really Muslim people? Like, I felt like we're trying to insinuate something. And so I'd rather people just say it. I don't like when they insinuate. But what does it mean to be dark skinned? Like, are we saying that they're other? Listen, everybody, they're other. They're not really American. I don't know what that meant. So and then it turned out to be wrong in addition. But even when it was being said, it just seemed to me to be not a very useful piece of information because, first of all, what does that even mean? That's a ridiculous, it reminds me of in local news we used to do, there's a 5'10" black man on the right, like what? Oh, okay, that narrows it down to about 1 million people I know. Like, what does that mean? It's not helpful, it's not a good descriptor, and I think especially when you're talking about something so sensitive and so important, like let's take a moment to make sure that the information we're giving, we have to get out because it's so critical. It's going to help people figure out who this is. And I don't think that description, which ended up being wrong, was even a good descriptor at all. So, I think, again, if maybe somebody had sort of said, like, let's think about this for a moment, that probably would have been slowed down a little bit. But again, it came from his sources, which, when things are very emotional, you could sort of see how you could have several sources all kind of sharing the same piece of information. So what feels like 3 sources is not really 3 sources, right? It's one source that spread it to 3 different people at a time when people were very, freaked out and upset, obviously. Thank you for that question. Yeah.
I do want to ask that we be conscious of time and of your time, Soledad. I think we can take about 2 or 3 more questions.
Okay.
Thank you so much for being here. You're incredible and extremely inspiring. The question I have is that when it comes to daily current news, to me, it's very damning and very just catastrophic. And so, you have an opportunity with documentaries and news shows and stuff to show more sides of a news story.
What daily news do you watch? Do you really watch daily news?
Do I watch daily news? Like, for instance, when you're walking past a newsstand and you see the cover of Sun-Times and Chicago Tribune, it's always like these really negative stories. And then also, too, if I turn on WGN, there's also these negative stories as well. There's never really no positive stories at all, for me, that I see within the daily news. And I was just wondering, do you ever see that changing where they will show all sides of a story and make it a little more...
You know what I see changing is the Pew did a study recently that said people are disappointed with their local newscast. And I think part of what you're describing is that, right? Which is it's a way to get a big audience to scare the crap out of people, but at the same time, you chip away at what you're getting. It's that it undermines your own product, right? Mm-hmm. Like, but on one hand, you sort of are able to kind of get people scared, but at the same, slowly over time, you start eroding their confidence. I get up, I go to Twitter, right, and I can totally tell on Twitter what's happening in the news. Because I can follow people's threads, and there's certain people who I follow who I can self-select the interesting stories that I want to follow. And most people who are your age, I know, are not sitting down and watching a newscast, much to the, chagrin of newscasters, that they're actually going to different platforms to sort of say, like, I don't want all of this. I want to know this and this and this and this and this. And I know that there will be a buzz. I know when an earthquake has happened, right? Because all of a sudden everyone's like, hey, did you feel that? And you're like, oh, there must have been an earthquake in LA. And, about 5 minutes later, someone will officially, from some news organization, will say, there was a 6.3 just happened and whatever. But I already knew it, so I no longer, that has changed breaking news because people are early reporters of it. I guess I just don't, I know what I'm going to get when I watch local news. Thank you. Hi.
Hi, good evening. My question goes back to what you referred to earlier as minorities having very few, I guess, airtime in stories and I guess, daily news. It could also mean radio, and just not the few stories are out there, and not the full spectrum of our lives, and not correct representation, I guess, of minority populations is out there. So how do you think we can fix that? Is it igniting interest? Is it maybe getting people from channels like, say, the Latin Univision, getting some of those reporters who do, I guess, within their own stations, report on more of the full spectrum? What do you think would help get a better
I'd say number one, support people who do the stories you like, right? Because often people will watch shows that they hate. Flavor Flav, but like, and they can tell you every single thing that happened. You're like, okay. Then clearly you don't dislike it that much because you know exactly what's going on. So, people are doing stories that you think are interesting, support them. And I think there's just, don't support the ones that you don't think are doing well. And I'm a big believer in, because of technology, tell the stories you're interested in. Make sure that those things are being told. People more than ever are interested in the diverse market. Trust me. The first conversations I had when I was leaving CNN was, I own Black in America, I own Latino in America. And about 10 different people asked me, can I buy that from you to air on our network so we can re-air it and redo it? Because they understand there's a value in the market. So this is a very valuable demographic that, some people are ignoring it, fine, ignore them back, move on. Go to where the stories that you are interested in are being covered and then support those people, I think is a really, best way to do it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi. Thank you for coming to our school. I want to welcome you. But my question is really about tangible steps that we can take as students at the University of Chicago. You touched upon a few things that, that would help keep the hope alive, but really, I'm sure they, brought you up to date about why we're having these series of talks, especially with students of color and minorities. But, when we're faced with either students who are being, singled out because of their race or because of other things and are not positive, we're feeling like there isn't a welcoming spirit at the university, or the reaction
So I'd say two things. I know where you're going with this.
Sure.
We've had a lot of these conversations today. So I'd say two things.
Okay.
The first is you need to open up the conversation, right? So you need to figure out how to get people who should be part of the conversation into the conversation so that you're not just talking to the choir, right? Because here I'm assuming everybody's in the choir. They find it interesting. They love talking about diversity, but you have to figure out. So I want you to ponder the question, how do I get those students who really should be part of this conversation in the seats? How do I do that? How do you make it interesting to them? How do they come in and feel like, oh, I'm going to come in and be attacked for whatever? No. So think about that. What can you do to make it a real open conversation where people feel like it's safe to take whatever position they may have? And also, sort of a rejoinder to that is, and that in your heart, you're not trying to change them, right? You cannot say, I really want to hear your voice, but really mean because I really want you to agree with me. It has to be, I really want to hear your voice because your opinion, even though I may completely disagree with it, is important. I want to know what you're thinking. It's a hard thing to do. As I was telling some of the students earlier, when some people would watch Black in America, they say, well, you're not really Black. I was like, so offended. And then I realized, okay, the best thing to do is to say, okay, well, what does that mean? And what do you mean by that? Talk to me about what's really Black. How do you define that? You clearly have a definition in your head. What is that? And we just keep going with a question, right? No matter what they'd say, we go back with another question. Okay, so that's interesting. Tell me about this, and tell me about that. Right? It wasn't, how dare you say that to me? And that's hard. It is very hard when someone says something distasteful to not say, what? You are so totally wrong. But to say, wow, that's interesting. I never thought about it that way. Tell me why you feel that way. That's very hard. And then number two, stop worrying so much about distasteful things people say. I will tell you, as my mother said when she was spit on, at some point you have to decide, like, I'm trying to get to this. And your job is to fight to make this university everything you want it to be. And along that path, there's going to be some unpleasant moments. And you just got to suck it up and keep going. because there are going to be people who do mean things and say mean things and hang Confederate flags and do inappropriate things, and you can spend a lot of your energy fighting them to the point where you're not accomplishing what you need to accomplish. You know, America's better than that. Fight the good fight, but also remember you have a thing to get to. And I think if you can do those two things, constantly ask for dialogue, always want to understand what people are doing, but at the same time, don't take it personally and keep moving forward, you can actually accomplish a lot. Does that help? More specific? Good.
That's pretty good.
Okay. I'll take that. Thank you very much.
you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much. I do want to invite everyone.